Happy New Year. Japanese-American relations mean a great deal to me. It is therefore a great privilege always to talk to a Japanese audience, particularly to so distinguished an audience as that of the top management seminar. Great pleasure to see you all.
Doctor, we finally have a New Year 1988. You were pointing out that in your article in Newsweek magazine, you were expecting a lot of change in 1988, also 15 years ahead. What is your view on 1988? Do we have good news or bad news in 1988?
Now, in 1988, in the field of foreign policy, I think we will have good news. In the field of economic policy, it will be much more mixed. In the field of foreign policy, we will have successes, but they may create problems for the future.
I think in the Newsweek article, you were saying that to look 15 years ahead is to see a radically different world. By then, Japan will have considerably more military power. China will be much stronger, and you talked about other countries too. What do you expect in the relations between U.S. and Japan?
Let me explain what my basic point is. The article to which you referred dealt with the summit.
Yes.
And it analyzed some of the agreements that were made at the summit. Mm-hmm. The basic point of the article is that these agreements are dealing with nuclear relations between the United States and the Soviet Union.
Yes, it was.
And therefore, and they do not deal with the new world that is coming into being. Mm-hmm. Now, I believe that within 10 to 15 years, there will be new power centers, and that the pretension of the United States and the Soviet Union that the question of war and peace can be settled entirely by them, mm-hmm. and entirely by their own internal nuclear arrangements may no longer be relevant. Mm-hmm. I think Japan is bound to become a more important country due to the weight of its economy. And without arguing whether Japan should spend 1%, 2%, or 3% for its national defense, even if it remains at 1%, given the growth of the gross national product, mm-hmm. Its military potential will increase. But I think it will go up towards 2% and maybe beyond. Many of my Japanese friends are of the view that it will be at least 2%. Mm-hmm. But percentages aren't so important. The realities are Japan will be a more powerful country. China, realistically, by 15 years from now, will either have succeeded or failed in its economic reform. I believe it will succeed. If it succeeds, its military potential will increase. India will become more powerful. Western Europe will unite. So, inherently, we will live in a new world in which the relative position of the United States and the Soviet Union, while still important, will decline. And my argument in that article was that the United States and the Soviet Union are sort of counting warheads, and they're not paying attention to the fundamental changes which will affect the future in a much more significant way.
I see. Doctor, the successful summit between United States and Soviet Unions was very good news last year to everybody in the world. And in your article was something that I didn't see was in regard to Japan and other Far Eastern countries in relation to Soviet Unions. Doctor, we have in Japan frequent appearances of Soviet submarine in Japan Sea, and also sometimes Soviet jet fighter, they violate Japan's territory. And a couple of months ago, Japanese Self-Defense Force jet fighter try to shoot only by threatening them. And also KGB activities in Japan are vigorous always. And also every year, Japanese fishermen must have very hard time to negotiate with the Soviet Union how much we can catch fish in the Northern Sea. We are so closely related to Soviet Unions. And doctor, what is your view on Japan and other Far Eastern countries in relation to Soviet Unions?
Well, the Soviet Union in recent years has indicated much greater activity in the Far East. Under the previous government, with Brezhnev and Gromyko, they were really focused first on the United States, second on Europe, very little on Asia. I don't know whether Gromyko ever visited Japan. I don't think so. And at any rate, it was very unusual for the Soviet Union to engage. And I think I don't know, I don't remember when he visited China, but his major focal point of activity was the West. Now the Soviet Union is much more active in Asia. It has established bases in Indochina. It has a fishing fleet in the South Pacific. It runs regular reconnaissance flights over Japan or near Japan, and it has the submarine activities. So it is very possible that it is in fact very likely that the Soviet Union pressure on its neighboring countries in Asia will increase. And this is not really taken care of by these summit meetings that deal only with nuclear questions. The Soviet Union is certain to be very uneasy about the emergence of a strong China, and will also be uneasy about Japan. And they look at this in part as a strategic problem.
Specifically about Japan, doctor, how the United States can be a part of Japanese situation in relation to Soviet Russia?
Well, it depends what area we're talking about. In the security field,
yes,
an attack by the Soviet Union on Japan would be a threat to vital interests of the United States. We not only have an agreement with Japan, but we also have self-interest, because if the Japanese industrial potential were added to that of the Soviet Union, it would be a radical shift in the world balance of power. So the United States would have to come to the assistance of Japan if Japan were directly threatened. And of course, I believe Japan would fight too, and would be a formidable opponent. Now, in the political field, of course, Japan has claims to 2 islands,
yes,
and other claims,
yes,
which are essentially a bilateral issue between Japan and the Soviet Union. The United States, I'm sure, is sympathetic to the Japanese point of view.
right,
But that is a matter that the Japanese government really needs to pursue on its own. In the economic field, I believe that the Soviet Union will try to seduce Japan by indicating prospects for development of Siberia and maybe other areas. The problem is, how are they going to pay for it? And what commercial exchange can take place? That's one question. And the strategic question that Japan has to ask itself and the US has to ask itself is, until there's a change in Soviet foreign policy, to what extent is it to our interest to strengthen the Soviet economy? Because with the existing foreign policy, a strengthened economy will only enable it to be even more aggressive.
Doctor, very latest news, Japanese newspaper reported that Japanese companies decided to establish a joint venture with the Soviet Union, and we are facing in we're getting in a new business relationship with Soviet Russia. Is that bothering United States?
No, it's bothering me, not the United States, but it's bothering me not as a Japanese problem, but as a problem of the industrial democracies. Everybody is doing it. The Germans are doing it. Some Americans are doing it. I'm sure French and British are either doing it or will soon be doing it, and Italians. It is a it is a problem of the industrial democracies. My question is, why do this before we have a political agreement with the Soviet Union? That is the key question. Why strengthen the Soviet Union before there is a change in Soviet foreign policy? But I don't think Japan is doing anything other than what others are doing. So it is not a cause of bilateral tension.
What about, Doctor, Japanese high-tech export to Soviet Russia, which we had a very difficult problem last year?
You mean the Komatsu?
No, Toshiba.
Oh, Toshiba, yes. Well, we have the so-called COCOM list.
Yes.
And violations of the COCOM list will, of course, produce a problem, because that means that we are helping the Soviet Union, again, before there has been a political accommodation. I believe, incidentally, that the reaction of some Americans to the Toshiba case, specifically the destruction of Japanese goods on the steps of Capitol Hill, was a disgrace and inexcusable, even though I disagree with the actions of the Toshiba company in making its technology available.
Getting back to the issue of security, you also pointed out that Japan is now spending 1% or 2% of GNP for...
Not yet 2%, but it's heading in that direction.
Heading to the direction, right. Do you think Japan has to spend more to protect themselves from...
Well, you know, Americans have a great propensity to be schoolmasters of the whole world. The other hand, I look at Japan. It has been independent for 2,000 years. It has a much longer history of maintaining its independence than the United States has. So I think Japan is a perfectly good judge of what it requires for its security. And I think Americans ought to stop lecturing Japan about what security needs it has. I believe that Japan, for its own reasons, for Japanese reasons, will decide to increase its spending. That is up to Japan. I do not believe the United States should urge Japan, for American reasons, to increase its defense expenditures.
I see. Doctor, I'd like to get into the subject of Japan in the U.S. relations. Since you got office in the White House in 1969, I think you have dealt with Japanese a lot.
Yes.
And in your books, I have found that issues that you handled, Okinawa, return of Okinawa, and textile issue, and also you handled oil crisis in relation to Japan also. And also you describe Japanese very unique, different from other peoples in the world to deal with. And how do you characterize, through your experience, the Japanese diplomacy?
Well, for an American and brought up on Western traditions, it requires a lot of education to learn to deal with the Japanese. When I first started to work in government, I thought that the way to deal with Japanese is to try to convince the relevant minister of whatever it was that the issue concerned, and then he would make a decision. it took me quite a few years actually to understand that decisions in Japan are made differently. That nobody, not even the prime minister, is in a position to say that as an act of his personal will, he can decide on his own what he wishes to do, like an American president. The story is that Lincoln, in a cabinet meeting, said the votes are 9-1 against, and we will do it. That could not happen in Japan. So I had not understood the role of consensus in Japanese decision-making. And therefore, for Westerners to deal with the Japanese, it is very important to understand that first, in my view, and of course, the distinguished members of your audience need no lecture from me about Japanese. I have learned, and maybe I'm wrong, that one should never put a Japanese in a position where he has to say yes or no as his own personal expression. Because he may say yes, and it only means, yes, I have understood you. Not, yes, I'm going to do what you want me to do. To act, most Japanese that I have known have to go back to their group, and they have to discuss it, and then they take it as a joint decision. Actually, it's a very good way to make decisions, because it may be a little slower than ours, but it means the execution is more meticulous. Then I think there are other differences. Japanese are culturally extremely cohesive. Japanese leadership groups have been in office a long time, because if you look at Japanese cabinets, the top leaders, the heads of the factions, more or less remain for decades. And so there is a basic group that leads in Japan that has great continuity. You may change your prime minister. Well, no prime minister except Nakasone really has served more than 4 years since Sato. And even Nakasone only served 5 years. But the Japanese continuity is much greater than in the United States. It is unthinkable that a Japanese prime minister would come into office and say, like the American president will say next January, I'm going to re-examine all the policies and I'm going to re-study everything. So these are important differences, and they lead to important misunderstandings. I always, whenever an American president meets a Japanese prime minister, it is always announced they agreed. And I always say all that means is that the prime minister will now go home and explain your point of view and maybe support it. But you have to wait a month or two to see what the Japanese will actually do.
Doctor, the Japanese uniqueness, now you pointed out, at the same time you pointed out this book.
Uniqueness, that's one other aspect about Japanese uniqueness.
Yes.
The Japanese, of all the societies that I know, are culturally so special and so homogeneous that they believe, correctly in my view, that they can manage every change in the international equilibrium and still remain Japanese. The Japanese were a closed society until the middle of the 19th century.
Right.
They then adopted Western ways after Commodore Perry forced his way in, because they were determined never again to be pushed around by foreigners. So they learned many Western forms, but they still remained Japanese. Then it was a particular form of society until World War II. After World War II, Japan changed to a democratic system, but they still remain Japanese.
Right.
And they can make other changes, because the essence of Japan, the uniqueness of Japan, cannot be touched by foreign influences.
Right. Doctor, that unique essence that Japanese has, do you think that Japanese can continue to have that uniqueness to survive in this global age?
Well, it presents a problem for other nations, because the reverse side is that, quite frankly, Japanese usually have great difficulty understanding the psychology of foreigners, just as foreigners have great difficulty understanding the psychology of Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
My view, however, is that that Japan will have to remain in essence what it is, or it will not be able to do what it has done for thousands of years. But
Mm-hmm.
I believe that it will remain essentially what it has been. It would be desirable if it could broaden its horizons a little bit and develop a more general view, but that will be a slow process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Dr. Reischauer, he pointed out to me when I met him that the uniqueness in culture, uniqueness in group-making decision, uniqueness in tradition, uniqueness in character is really the key for Japanese success.
I agree with Professor Reischauer, who was a teacher of mine.
Okay. Doctor, then understanding those Japanese uniqueness at the White House now, today, do you think that Reagan administration is dealing with Japan based on that kind of understanding?
No. I don't believe that they really do. Partly because they come from the west of America, which is not really all that interested in foreign policy, and which has its own form of unique behavior, different from the Japanese. Mm-hmm. So I think we do not have enough people in either party who really understand the Japanese mentality. Mm-hmm. And I think the Reagan administration relies too much on set-piece negotiations, mm-hmm. and too little on cultivating the consensus. Mm-hmm. I think if one wants to achieve something permanently in Japan, one must have a constant dialogue. One cannot make demands with a deadline, mm-hmm. and have them met.
I see.
I didn't know that myself when I started in government. I did everything wrong when I first dealt with Japan.
Well, Doctor, when I had a chance to see at U.S. government in relation to Japan, that person pointed out to me that if we don't give deadline to Japanese government, they are not going to move. That's how he remarked. Do you agree with this view on Japan?
I think it is very difficult to get the Japanese government to do what it doesn't want to do with or without a deadline, because even if they meet the deadline, you then have the problem of how they execute it. Mm-hmm. And the Japanese bureaucracy is so marvelously disciplined, mm-hmm. that if they don't want to do something, it is very difficult to get it done. Mm-hmm. So technically it may be right to give a deadline. I think one has to convey a sense of urgency and importance to the Japanese negotiating partner. I would not recommend